not worth our being here if he's not worthy, but he is. Amen? He is our great and righteous Savior. It's good to see you. Crowd's growing every week. I appreciate that. I'm glad to have you here. It's encouraging. And I hope that God has been keeping you. I know he has been. I hope that you've been acknowledging that is what I should say, I guess, every single day we live. Well, let's find our way back to 1 Peter chapter 1. I'm not sure. I just don't know how these things sync up all the time, how that God aligns Sunday school lessons, sermons, messages. I don't look at the Sunday school curriculum when I'm determining what to preach. As a matter of fact, there are times I had preached through books when you guys were studying in that book. So that tells you I didn't look. But I'm not going to put it past God to align things. God synchronizes what we need to hear. And he allows us to be exposed to that at just the right moment. So, hey, that lesson this morning about trials, if you weren't listening to that, you're not going to get this today either. God allows them. And our response to them tells us where we are in our faith. Our response to most things explains to other people where we are in our relationship with God. It's really that simple. We don't like to think about it, but that's the truth. So here in this first chapter of 1 Peter, what Peter is saying to these Christians who are being persecuted is, look, you got to get your eyes off of what's happening. Put it toward God in heaven. Your goal is not a better earthly life. It's not. And the more I think about it, the more I realize that is still the struggle of every single Christian when going through difficulties. We ask the question, God, why is this happening? I thought things were supposed to be smoother than this. I thought you were supposed to help me in life and make things easier when I got saved. I thought that your presence in my life was going to make me immune from these trials and difficulties. When you start at that point, you got a long road. Because the first trip you have to make is in your understanding of what God is doing. So let me just get this straight with you, okay? The Bible backs this up. God is not interested in making us happy. Find it in the Bible. I'll eat those words in front of everybody. God is not interested in making us happy. He's not interested in making us successful. Not interested in making us rich. He's not interested in making us influential in a secular way. By the way, he's not interested in doing that for churches either. You looking at me funny? Am I right or am I wrong? Sobering truth, isn't it? What is God interested in? He tells us over and over and over again. He is interested, number one, in his own glory. Now, if you think that makes God selfish, you don't know God. You don't understand God anyway. God is about himself. Now, you can't think about that in human ways because that would make him selfish. But God's not like us. There's no wrong motive about God. Everything God has ever done was to honor himself, including saving you. When you start looking at it that way, you think, okay, so maybe my purpose in life is to figure out what my place is in honoring him. How are my reactions to what's happening to me? Are they honoring him? Because when that becomes our sole desire, God answers that prayer. God works. God unleashes his own power in our life and the world around us to bring that about. God's not interested in any of the other things I've mentioned. He's not. The church growth movement of the 80s, late 80s, early 90s, I was educated during those years. And I have to tell you, it was almost like brainwashing. I saw something the other day that said the cleanest part of the human body is the brain now because it's been washed so many times. They're probably right. God's not interested in building human monuments in churches. And in the late 80s and early 90s, that's what we did. The evangelical world said, oh man, let's build these great churches for God. And I'm going to tell you something. The pragmatism it took to build those churches cost us. It's still costing us. The Christians who inhabit the membership rolls of those churches are shallow. They don't know the Bible. They're very secular-minded. They're not biblical Christians. They're all about entertainment. They're about sensationalism. They're about growing their church, having their church be recognized as a community in the world, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I know what I'm talking about. I know the arguments. I've heard them. And I've watched that over and over again, and I've thought to myself, wow, what's going to happen? I even knew this back in my 20s. I thought to myself, what's going to happen when the church is persecuted and these grand cathedrals we have built supposedly in the name and honor of Christ, what's going to happen when those ministries fail and fall and nobody wants to come because it costs you as a citizen if you really follow God? I'll tell you what's going to happen. Those great halls and cathedrals are going to be hollow. They're going to be empty. If they're inhabited, they're going to be inhabited by people who are towing the company, government, socialist, whatever line it's going to be in those days, and it's going to be against God, compromising. Real Christians are going to be meeting anywhere they can. Might have heat, might not. Might have a cushion to sit on, you might not. Probably going to be hiding. Who's going to meet then? Who values the church then? The reason I say all that is that this is so applicable to us. There's only the one answer, and I have had this discussion with people far more influential than myself. The one answer to what's happening and what has happened in the American church for the past 20 years, the correction is persecution. It will reveal everything. It will straighten everything out. Boy, y'all are feeling really better now, aren't you? If you're serious about being a God follower, you're listening. What Peter's dealing with is the trying of our faith. Does God do that just to be doing it? Does he toy with his followers like they're a puppet on a string? No. He's always doing something, as I said, to honor himself and to make us more like him. Now, the way Peter approaches this, after acknowledging they're being persecuted, he reminds them that their inheritance is nothing on earth. Nothing on earth. It's not to make their life better here, but it's to guarantee them an inheritance in heaven. Until we get that mindset, we're not going to understand what Peter's saying. But once you get that, then you start thinking, well, maybe this will be worth it after all. And that's what Peter proves. And here's what he says, beginning in verse number 6. And talking about trials, wherein greatly you rejoice. Why in the world would any sane man put trials and rejoice in the same passage? Because he knows God. He's got the right perspective. If now, though, for only a season, if need be, you are in heaviness through manifold, that is, through various temptations. What we did last week was we went to the Scriptures, allowed them to comment on themselves, and to see where the word, the idea of trials, as it's presented here, is found. We talked about several of those. But then it begins this in verse number 7. So last week we looked at the different types of trials. Now today I want to take Simon Peter's words inspired by the Holy Spirit, not mine but his, and I want to share with you, first of all, the testing of trials. Look in verse number 7. That the trial of your faith, notice it's not just to put you through a hard time, the trial of your faith, being much more precious than of gold that perishes, though it be tried with fire, might be found unto praise and honor and glory at the appearing of Jesus Christ. Do you see anything in there about you or about me? Nope. It's all about him, isn't it? It's all about honoring Christ, whom having not seen, again, he's still focused on him, you love, in whom, though you now see him not, yet you believe, you rejoice with joy unspeakable and full of glory. And here's the reward. Receiving the end of your faith. Who wants to receive the end of their faith? Oh, I do. What is the end of faith? It's the salvation of your souls. The testing of faith. It will seem obvious that these readers will be asking one question. The same question we ask whenever God allows difficulties in our life. You know what the question is? It's comprised of one word, starts with a W. It's not who, it's not what, it's why. God, why are you allowing this to happen? Why has my health failed? Why have my finances collapsed? Why did my job evaporate? Why are these people tormenting me? Why are they criticizing? Why are they acting like they are? Why are you allowing this? Now, it's an easy question to ask. It's a hard question to answer. We often ask why, and while usually our mindset is such that we never arrive at the right answer, in one way, Simon Peter is actually answering that question. So next time something happens, and in your mind you are tempted to say, God, why? Turn right here. And Simon Peter answers that question. Maybe not in the way you want to hear it at the moment, maybe not with the specificity you want, but he answers the why trials do come. First answer, number one, is to prove that our faith is real. That's simple. Now you see in verse number 7 that he says this, that the trial of your faith, being much more precious than of gold that perishes. Then let me just stop reading there for a second and sort of explain that for a minute. It's obvious that God doesn't need to test us, try us to know that our faith is real. God knows. God knows whether or not you're a real Christian. God knows how strong your faith is. God knows that. But there's an obvious reason as to why he tries anyone or allows trials, and that is not so that he will know, but so that you will know. And so that I will know about my own faith, how strong is it. So let's spend a couple of minutes here on the value of true faith. How valuable is true faith? Well, when you just read the words here, they're translated very literally in the King James. Nothing wrong with that. But let me explain what I think Simon Peter is saying. The word translated trial here is indeed a noun. That the trial of your faith is more precious than gold. Well, when you're in the middle of a trial, is that experience precious to you in that moment? Not usually. We would not put it very high on our list of appraisal. That's not how we see it. We don't see the trials God allows, the actual situation, as being valuable. Now, it can be, and you have to sort of get through it to understand. Here's how James used it, using the same words. And we preached on this a few years ago. In chapter 1, verse 3, he said that the trying of your faith works patience. Right? We know that it does. But Simon Peter uses this word in more of a descriptive sense. It's more like an adjective. And other translations, I think, have it right, and even the Greek lexicons have it right, the ones I checked. And what Simon Peter is saying is that the successful trying, the genuineness of your faith is more precious than gold. Basic faith is cheap, isn't it? Easy believism is cheap. You can stand in a concert, you can stand in an evangelistic meeting, and that guy can pull on your heartstrings and give you some manipulative car wreck story. At the end of that, now who among you will pray this prayer after me? You raise your hand. Is that valuable faith? Maybe, maybe not. Doesn't cost you anything. That's cheap faith. What is valuable faith? Valuable faith is faith that is tested and has been proven and refined. That's what we have failed to understand in the church of the living God. And Jesus explained that in the parable of the sower and the seed. All that seed sprouts, doesn't it? Every bit of it germinates. I put out grass seed in my yard every fall, and man, some of it gets in my brick chips. That's the first stuff that comes up, isn't it? And then you got to kill that because you don't want it. It would, unfortunately, those brick chips serve as mulch. It doesn't fit into Jesus' parable, but it's in the wrong place. And so you come back with Roundup when it warms up and you kill that, right, because you don't want it there. All the seed comes up. Somebody raises their hand. Somebody shakes the pastor's hand. Somebody signs a card. Somebody joins a church. All of that is cheap until it's tested. When it's tested and proven, man, that's the most valuable thing in the world. How would you know how valuable your faith is until God allows it to be tried? I did a little research. I read, looked up the various ways that gold is refined. That's the precious metal Simon Peter uses to compare the value of our faith. And in his day, that was the standard. Used to be here, not anymore. But anyway, he said, tried faith that's found to be genuine is more precious than the most valuable metal in the world. How is gold tested and tried and refined? There's really only about 3 or 4 different ways that it can happen. The first method that is used in refining of gold is heat, and you guys understand that. What happens is gold that comes out of the earth as ore. It's not perfect. It's not purified. And I was watching some show the other day, held captive by the people I was with, and I enjoyed watching these shows. Y'all know what was recorded, right? And so they were mining this gold. And they had millions of dollars of equipment. And they were risking. They bought the rights of this land and having to pay royalties. And they were digging and scooping dirt and putting it in big dump trucks, all for a little shiny golden colored flake. When you first take it out of the ground, it's not as valuable. But you apply heat, and what happens? Well, you separate it mechanically maybe, but then you apply heat, and that heat melts the gold along with everything else that it's connected to. What happens is that heat causes the impurities to separate from the pure gold in the molten state, and the impurities come to the top, and you just scoop them off. Now, there are other ways now that it's used, and they all fit into what Simon Peter's saying. Not only is heat used to refine gold, but acid is used. There are some acids that act detrimentally on gold, but if you use the right one, it only acts on the impurities. And what it does, you mix the acid with the gold, and what happens is the impurities solidify where they can be separated. And then there are other ways. Sometimes it's a combination of that. And then there's another one. They use electrical current. You pass electrical current through molten gold ore. And what happens is it separates the gold from everything else. Every one of those methods, and the last one is sort of a mixture of all of them, but every one of those methods, if you'll think about it, you don't want to have applied to you. Do you? I don't like heat in my life. Heat's stress. I don't like heat. None of us like heat. I remember moving to Jacksonville, Florida in 1984. Stepped out of my little car, which had no air conditioning then anyway. You could do that when you were 19 years old. I couldn't survive it now. But I could back then. But man, I remember on that hot, humid August afternoon, I stepped out on the black asphalt pavement in Jacksonville, Florida, in the shadow of the Gator Bowl at that time. And I remember thinking to myself and praying to God, what have I done? It was that bad. Overwhelming. And I remember for the first 6 months, it was hard. I bet I sweated more in that 6 months than I have in the time since. Now, the good thing about that is once you move back home, for the first 20 summers, y'all are like sweating yourself to death. I'm like, this ain't nothing. This is like autumn to me. And we can thank that for having Ralph and Patty and Richard here. It's not about the people they love. It's about escaping the heat. Nobody likes heat. You repel from fire, which is why fire, being purifying and being so dreaded, is the perfect, and I mean perfect, allegory, perfect symbol for trial. But then there's acid. The Bible doesn't use acid, but boy, does it fit right here too. Does it not? Man, there are some things you get on you, and you know you've got it on you immediately because it burns and it stings and it destroys. You can actually destroy human bodies in a bathtub with enough hydrochloric acid. If your wife starts buying extra bottles, guys, you better check, She's about to get rid of you some way. After she kills you, she's going to dissolve you. You'll actually do it. You get that on you in a living body, it will burn. It will cause the skin to... We stay away from acid, right? But acid, when it comes to something precious, has a purifying effect. The heat of trials. We understand that. But man, does not acid speak to you of people? People will give you heartburn worse than anything else. And the unjust criticism and illogical criticism and maltreatment and abuse, anything you can describe as coming from another person is like acid. You think to yourself, God, why am I going through this? Go back to the passage. It requires faith to get through it. Trusting God over your reputation, over your situation, over anything. That process refines. It's no wonder that the man who followed Charles Spurgeon at the Metropolitan Tabernacle in London, was there prior to him, I should say, wrote this: when through fiery trials thy pathway shall lie, my grace all sufficient shall be thy supply. The flame shall not hurt thee, I only design thy dross to consume and thy gold to refine. That's what God's doing every single time. Heat, acid. But you know what? The heat never gets too hot to destroy us. It only refines. The acid never gets too caustic to destroy us. It only refines. Often the current of stress is used, like they use that electro current passing through molten gold. The current of stress is used to produce a material more precious than anything else on earth. In the same way, our faith has to be purified, doesn't it? That's what all those processes do. Other metals, there's other processes too I think we could add to this. Other metals such as iron are made more valuable by heat and stress, aren't they? You pull a bar of iron ore out of the earth. I've never handled iron ore. I've seen pictures of it, of course. But when you pull that out of the earth, you begin to maybe temper it. And that's a term which I think fits right in here too. I remember my granddad would used to take a knife blade, and the first thing he would do if it was carbon steel is he would bake a cake of cornbread and stick it in there. Anybody ever seen that done? I don't know if it worked or not. He thought he was tempering the edge. Now what tempering does is it either adds hardness or reduces hardness. depending on what needs to happen. There are times when your faith is just too hard and rigid, and God needs to temper it where he can bend it. Are you listening? Sometimes your faith is much too soft, and God has to strengthen it, and he applies heat and stress. While I really don't know how much is enough in any given situation, God knows exactly how much is enough to make it valuable. What's the perfect illustration of that? You take a bar of iron ore out of the earth, and these prices are probably, I found these prices, they're probably old now, of course, but the relationship is still the same. You pull the iron ore out of the ground untempered, might be worth $5. I mean, you'd have to sell it to someone who's going to process it. But that person takes that iron and tempers it. And from that same bar, they produce a set of, or maybe, a dozen horseshoes or several horseshoes. There was a time when maybe that would double the worth of that iron. Those horseshoes would be worth maybe about $10.50. But if you were more industrious and you added heat and stress and more refining, and you made sewing needles. Ladies, you know what I'm talking about, maybe. You take those sewing needles, the combined weight or the combined value of that iron ore, then, same amount of ore, would be worth about $3,200 if you sold them individually. But if you take that same bar of iron ore, apply more heat and stress to where it becomes spring metal, and process it into maybe thousands of watch springs, that same bar of ore, now is worth approximately $250,000. What's the difference? They're all iron. The only difference is the amount of heat and stress. Processing. Processing is such a cold word, isn't it? But that's exactly what God is doing. He's doing it in your life. He's definitely doing it in my life. He's processing me. Some things he's heating up enough where it floats to the top where he can just swipe it off. Other ways he's applying acid where something that I maybe didn't know was there solidifies where he can reach down with his ladle and just remove it. Other times that current, that process of separation which agitates me to no end, but God allows it. It separates good from bad in my life. And every bit of it God has allowed to make my faith more valuable. So the reason he tests us is to see if our faith is real and provides the value of our faith. But secondly, what he does in seeing if our faith is real is he venerates it. The veneration of our faith, the proving, the genuineness of it, the separation. Again, it's sort of the same process, but this fits so perfectly from the ancient world. Some of you may have grown up on a farm, and man, we've got combines now. My granddad had 2 or 3 during the course of my teenage years. He piddled with and played with. It seems like they're always tore up, and if you're going to keep an old combine, you better know how to work on something, I tell you that. But that always amazed me, what that was able to do. And frankly, the process of separating grain from husk is relatively speaking, is a new process. Some of you remember your grandparents talking about the steam engines that would come through this community and would set up to separate the grain that farmers had grown. And they would charge you, I guess, a percentage of the grain. What that thing would do is by the power of steam would separate the grain from the husk. Well, you realize that was a fairly new, even today, relatively speaking, invention. Because people have been growing grain for thousands of years, since the beginning of time. How did they do it? Well, various means. The Romans developed something that is perfectly fitted into what Simon Peter is saying. They took a cart, and instead of having wheels on it, they put a roller on it. Sort of looks like Fred Flintstone would be driving a horse cart, right? With a roller on it. In that roller, they would embed sharp pieces of iron and stone. And they would drive it back and forth across those sheaves of grain. Back and forth. And that roller with the iron and the stones would rip, and it would shred, and it would tear, but most importantly, it would separate. So then you could take a fork or some other implement and throw the whole stalk up in the air, and the wind would take away the stalk and the husk, and what would be left when it fell back down to the ground was whole grain. Would you like to know what that instrument was called? You see the first word up there? That's a Latin word. It was called a tribulum. Doesn't that fit the exact definition of what tribulation is for a Christian? Doesn't it? Perfect, isn't it? Sometimes you may feel like you're getting run over from every which way but loose. And the roller is embedded with the sharpest things you've ever seen. And it cuts and it shreds, but you have to understand what it's doing is it's separating. It's taking something that was basically unusable, and when the farmer's done with it, it's usable, it's valuable, it's marketable, it's edible. You see, whatever God allows, boy, didn't the children of Israel have that all messed up in the lesson today? By the way, that was unbelief. When they heard those 10 men so pessimistic and down on everything, and they believed them, and they didn't believe Caleb and Joshua. What was the problem? It wasn't opinion, it was unbelief. That wasn't to ruin them. What are we thinking? Yeah, God has brought me out here just to let me die. What kind of theology did they have? It was a bad one, I tell you that. And Caleb had to straighten it out, didn't he? He said, if God delights in us, let me ask you a question. I asked my young people this morning, my young married people. I said, does God ever get mad at you? What about you? Does God ever get mad at you? Does he? It's important. The answer is no. God delights in you. Now, he doesn't let you by with sin and rebellion. That's because he loves you. And he's not like a parent who disciplines. You know, these people say, I whip my kids and I always told them, I'm not mad at you. This hurts me worse than it does you. I never taught that. Either when I was getting it or when I was giving it. And these people talk about not being angry when you discipline. I'm thinking, you are nuts. There ain't no way you can do it, right? Because we're human beings. We're fallen. We're incapable of that. But God is not. God can discipline without anger. With 100% pure love. You say, Pastor, but God doesn't want me to sin. When I sin, he gets mad at me. No, he doesn't. If he did, you'd go to hell. Why is God not ever angry with you? Because he poured out his anger and wrath on his son. How do you think he saved you to start with? How do you think he drew you to himself to start with? And when we go through something, we say, oh, God must be mad at me or mad at them. Don't say that. You're revealing a total ignorance of what the gospel is. God isn't angry with us. And as Caleb and Joshua said, God delights in us. Even when tribulations come, it's not to ruin us. Ever. It's always to refine us. It's never to embitter us. It's always to make our faith better. Isn't that something? But what do we think when we go through something? Oh, God must be mad at me. What have I done? Maybe nothing. Maybe nothing. That's not the cause of trials. So Simon Peter was saying to these folks, listen, you've got to understand, God is doing this to prove your faith is real, but he's also doing this to produce a faithful response. How we respond, and what Simon Peter said here is almost out of our ability to understand. He said, rejoice. Can we all laugh together? Do we do that? Not even close. We complain and we squirm and we say, God, what have I done? Why is this happening? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We're just like the children of Israel. I see myself in them every time I read that. But Simon Peter presents a very idealistic idea. Hey, what about looking theologically at how much God does love you and what he's allowing and what he's doing? And what about rejoicing because he actually is paying attention to you? The thing we want to do is not give that faithful response. Malcolm Muggeridge, who was an author of years ago, made the observation that anything valuable, anything that had enhanced his existence in 75 years had always been through affliction and not through happiness, whether pursued or attained. Put another way, in the light of God's perfection and purpose, would we really want to live a life free of hardship? Because if we did, our faith would never grow and we would never be made more like Christ. Never. So finally, I want to share with you as we leave, just briefly, there's a temptation to trials. What's the temptation? It's easy. It's to escape. I was thinking about my brothers in the ministry. The first thing a pastor starts thinking about when heat's turned up is leave. I'll go get me another church. Well, I've been here 30 years. That doesn't mean I've never thought that. Okay? I know how that goes because I'm a human being. But you know what? That's what happens in members' hearts too. They get something discombobulated, a little sideways, and I'll just go find me a church that suits me. Pastors and members both, let me tell you what happens. They go somewhere else. And they didn't respond faithfully to what God was doing in their life. And what happens is they find out that the same issues are there again. They're just in a different form. It's a different person, or it's a different pastor, it's a different church, it's a different whatever. Maybe by God's grace, pastors and members, when it happens, realize, you know what? The problem never was them, it was always me. And I never allowed God to do his perfect work in me. And I escaped. And then escaping, which is our human reaction, in escaping, changing scenery, they never changed, which is what God was doing to start with. Yeah, hey, I've sat around and dreamed about winning the lottery. I mean the Publishers Clearinghouse, right? Haven't you? I mean, if you got $10 million tomorrow, who would you write a stinking sorry, bitter letter to and say, nah, now I'll mess with it? You might not write that, but you would think that. Of course you would. Why? Because you haven't changed. Your attitude's still wrong. I got a feeling none of us are going to win the $10 million. If God's at work in our life, I don't think he'll let it happen. You know why? Because we'd escape his process. And what a sorry state our life would be in if we changed scenery and never allowed God to change our heart. That's what God's doing. After all, going back to the very first thing we said, trials ought to make us homesick, shouldn't it? Trials ought to remind us that this life is not the focus of our existence. It's getting ready to live over there. And that what God is doing now is separating. He's running the tribunum over me. He's applying heat and stress and acid and electricity of stress. He's putting it all in my heart and life so that when it's time, he will have finished his work in my life and I'll be more like him. I'll be fit for heaven. God's purpose, I don't care what the pastor in Houston says, is never our best life now. It's always, and I mean always, making us more like the one that we've never seen, but we still love. making us more like the one toward whom our heart is drawn every time we think of what is yet to come. Because, ladies and gentlemen, heaven's not going to be about loved ones. It's not going to be about streets of gold or gates of pearl. I promise you, in our glorified state, heaven will be about Jesus. That's what life is about now. Let's stand together, heads bowed and eyes closed. I'm going to ask Kelly to come, and maybe if she would not mind to play for just a second. And I want to give you an opportunity to respond. As always, the altar is here. You're welcome to come and pray. Maybe you want to respond and pray right where you are, where you're standing or where you're sitting. God knows your heart. I don't know anyone's heart except mine. I don't even know it all the time. The Holy Spirit is speaking to our hearts this morning. And he's applied stress, he's applied heat, and we have rebelled in disbelief against it. The greatest thing we can do today is say, God, have your will and your way in my life. Accomplish your purpose in my being so that I can honor Christ. Thank you for being here. So this month, next week, you turn the clocks back, right? Is that correct? We should have 160 in Sunday school then. So I think we'll send out a phone message saying, get out of bed. You've had an extra hour of sleep. No excuse next week, right? So just leave your clock where it is. You'll think, oh, I overslept. I guess I'll go to church anyway. So I'm just messing with you, okay? But not really. That was psychological seed planted in your heart. You'll think about it next Sunday morning. Great number in Sunday school this morning. Thank God for that. Let's see if we can up that next week. And encourage your family and friends to be here. We got a class for everybody, great teachers, and so I'm looking forward to that. Good crowd this morning. Thank you for being here. Got some other stuff planned this month. We'll let you know about it. Be safe. I love you. And whatever you're going through, whatever it is, trust him. That's the hardest thing you'll ever do, but trust him. Rick, would you close our meeting for us this morning?